Maslow's hierarchy of needs even has a whole bunch of problems with it. I mean, he plagiarized all that from the Blackfoot tribes. And
oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, he spent a year with them, and then all of a sudden had this epiphany about and he, the top of it is self-actualization, but in their traditions, it was community actualization. Like, you become self-actualized for the purpose of service to the tribe, rather than like for the purpose of building your empire or whatever the case might be.
Do you know what I look for to find the Blackfoot version?
There's some decent there's some folks who've done some articles on some of the background stuff up there. I think if you just Googled like Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Maslow plagiarism
or something like that, it would come up or whatever.
I made a joke about it
in the book in passing for sure, but
more important even than the psychedelic experience, individually, we have to reclaim the primacy of direct experience. As people, the real universe is within your reach, always.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the show. If it's your first time, welcome to the show. My name is Eric Osborne, and I'm not your guru, but I am happy to be your friend. I'm happy to be the host of this show. I'm just happy to be alive. And despite challenges, if you can't hear the background noise, it's my kids running around upstairs, running water. We are 3 weeks into no school, no childcare, losing our marbles here trying to get work done. So bear with me. This interview that I've got up for you today, though, is one I've been really excited to share for a while. It is with Doc Askins. He is an incredible physician, ketamine physician, actually, author as well of this book, The Anti-Hero's Journey. I believe he has written another workbook that goes along with this. He's just such an incredible and sweet human being with lots and lots of wisdom, a wonderful personality. He's had a lot of interesting experiences in personal growth through ketamine that he's going to share with us, and just his journey of becoming a better human, becoming an anti-hero. So I really hope you enjoy this. Check out all of his social media links. He has a podcast of his own. He's an inspiration to me, and I suspect that he will be one to you as well. All right, let's get to it. All right, everybody, welcome back. Welcome to, if you're brand new to the show, sit here with Doc Askins. Is that how you pronounce your last name?
Yeah,
Doc,
nailed it.
Author of Anti-Hero's Journey. I've been looking forward to this conversation. Doc and I have been getting to know each other a little bit here locally, and just seemed like a good place to squeeze in our chat finally in this discussion, this exploration of personal growth. And seems like psychedelics, or at least ketamine, has played a role in your personal growth. This story that you're sharing here is your story of personal growth.
Yeah.
Can I just drop us in? How did you even get on this path where we're at right now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a long story, right? Like, it could be 42 seconds, it could be 42 years long. We got, plenty of time to have the conversation. But yeah, to summarize it real briefly, like, I was one of the last soldiers out of Iraq in 2011 as a combat medic, and then through weird psychedelic synchronicities became one of the only members still serving in the Department of Defense that the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies trained to do MDMA-assisted therapy. So it's this weird sort of nexus point there.
Hold on. Say that again. You were one of the last soldiers coming out of Iraq, and you were one of
the first members of the DOD trained to do MDMA-assisted therapy. There's only like 3 of us.
Because you're a medic is how you got into that.
Yeah, I wound up being in one of the cohorts that was for underserved populations, and they considered veterans as a part of that. So I got accepted into the program as a veteran to participate. But because I'm still in the National Guard, I'm an Army captain, I'm still in the Department of Defense. So I'm at this weird node where I'm not really doing anything in the DOD with that, but that's my status now.
So was your work in military? I I don't know the language, but like you're working as a medic within the military, was that centered around mental health, or is that physical?
No, yeah, that's all trauma medicine. So
Okay.
it's like point of wounding care, tourniquets and chest tubes and crazy stuff like that, just trying to package up casualties and move them to the higher level of care after that. I spent 10 years as a combat medic and was okay enough at it that they selected me for the Inter-Service Physician Assistant program, or IPAP, which is it's the Army's PA program. It's like one of the best kept secrets out there. Like I got paid staff sergeant pay to go to school that most people go 6 figures into debt to do in the first place. That was, I was a bit of an adrenaline junkie. Like I had an undergrad doing outdoor education and intercultural studies, but like rock climbing in other countries didn't really turn into much of a career for like supporting a family or whatever. But I like doing a lot of crazy intense sort of stuff and was planning on going into emergency medicine. But during my clinical rotations at Fort Campbell, I got a call on a Sunday about a friend of mine that I'd served with who died by suicide. And the following day was working in the emergency room and an intentional overdose came in, and I wound up managing her care too. And I knew how to intubate and stabilize her and get her, to remain alive despite this attempt at ending her life. But I know the prognosis isn't great psychologically or physiologically after you take a large dose of question mark amounts of medicine. I wound up being confronted in that quick of a succession between losing my friend and then watching somebody attempt virtually right in front of me. It kind of broke my heart, and I started to look into mental health and the problems with depression and suicide and anxiety and trauma, and was a lot more curious about that. It was on my radar in a way that it had never, not quite as intensely been before. I have a Master of Divinity degree from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary here in Louisville, so I did this like Jedi mind trick on the chief of the ER and said, hey, would it be okay if I go talk with the chaplain to the family after intubating this lady, which is a weird sort of opportunity. And I walked into the room, and this guy could have been me. Like, he was an NCO in the 101st, had a little girl that was my little girl's age, and it just kind of cracked some things open inside of me. I said, I'm going to look into this a lot more and see what role I might be able to play doing that. And straight out of school, I got a job in outpatient psychiatry, and the outpatient psychiatrist doing managing the practice had a ketamine infusion component to his practice. So I just sort of fell into, he said, hey, will you take this on and figure out how to do this better than we've been doing it? So I'm a nerd and did all my homework and read all the papers about ketamine, and that was kind of my entry into the psychedelic space, more or less, was from the clinical route through the Army and psychiatry, rather than, like I was a straight edge kid growing up. I didn't do I had my first beer on my 21st birthday with my dad in a restaurant, nothing like crazy or intense, or didn't experiment whenever I was younger or anything like that, kind of straight-laced in that regard. I grew up in upstate New York, just outside of Rochester, like the Finger Lakes area. I was telling you before, like working on dairy farms and stuff. You say you're from New York and everybody thinks of the city, but I was just chucking hay bales as a kid. Got big. I was out there. Yeah.
Huh. Farm life led to getting fucked up in Kentucky.
Yeah. We moved down here to go to the seminary. That was why we moved here in the first place, and then I deployed to Iraq in the middle of that and got roped into like some pretty traumatic events along the way there. And there was kind of this 10-year period in between where, like most veterans, I was just going to drink about my problems and not talk about it, and was really making a mess of my own mental health and my own personal life in a whole bunch of ways. And that's kind of behind closed doors the standard for a lot of people.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Who, like you don't want to come out and say that's what's going on because that's a problem, but just doing it and keeping it quiet, and that's kind of
How do you bridge that gap? Like, how do you encourage military or folks who have been so kept things so close to open up?
Yeah, I think it's being vulnerable first. It's leadership is a really important thing in the military, and whenever leaders are the ones who step out and say, hey, I'm a person too, I'm broken in all of these different ways, like the expectations that are placed on us are really high, but I think that's what opens up the doors for a lot of people to raise their hand and say, hey, I'm having a hard time over here too. So I think it's it's a question of leadership, and leading in a way that's vulnerable and authentic opens up the opportunity to have some of those harder conversations. Like, I was giving people ketamine in clinic, and they were getting undepressed or dealing with their substance use issues or whatever, and then I was just going home and drinking myself. It was kind of this stark irony right in front of me that I couldn't see at the time, because you're just down in this dark hole of
Those means making.
traumatic memories and just trying to numb yourself out, and but you get out of the cave, you climb up out of the cave and you look back in, you go, boy, that was really dark, and you can see it now and kind of tell other people about it. And then there's people down in that cave, you can like, am I in the cave? Yeah, I think you are.
Which, that's the premise of this entire chapter, right? Is that the ultimate ends of personal growth is that it's a service of self that serves others, because we end up being the example, right? We lead by that example, and authentically is the goal. So, I mean, what ways have you seen yourself change since this path? I mean, to go from, it's interesting, like this journey you're talking about, from such a straight edge farm bred into kind of like the extremes of military, and now into the world of psychedelics.
Yeah.
Right. So, surely looking back at yourself, you're like, what the heck has just happened?
Been a wild ride for
Yeah,
sure. Yeah. I'm still trying to make sense out of it. What winds up guiding me a lot of the time are just sort of core beliefs, spiritual, fundamental, faith-based beliefs about the nature of the universe being love at the center of it, and that there's a way in which we're all connected, that you're just another me wandering around, and how would I want to be treated. Those sort of basic golden rule kinds of things are the things that I fall all the way back on and don't doubt anymore. So that's what guides the path forward, and I think it was what was guiding the path the whole way along. You got to live life going forward, and you can only make sense of it in the rearview mirror. But I can see a whole bunch of ways along the way that even the worst things that were happening to me were preparing me to help other people to get out of the worst things that are happening to them. And that's where a ton of meaning and satisfaction and joy comes out of all of that stuff, that I'm doing the therapy the way that I get to do it in my own practice, connecting with really cool people and having good conversations and just watching. Over and over again, all I want is to have a conversation with somebody and them to be 1% better than the moment before that we had that conversation. That's kind of how I think of my way of being in the world at this point. Just squirt a little dopamine in people's heads. That man out of here and throw the snow bunny. Like, hey, I feel better. Where'd that guy go?
It sounds more like Hero's Journey. Why the anti-hero?
Right, yeah, it does sound a lot like the hero's journey. I'm just up front calling it the anti-hero's journey to let everybody know. Not a fucking hero.
Well, how interesting you're on the Not Your Guru podcast.
Right? It's another one of those synchronicities, right? I just want to say at the outset, I'm fucked up, and that's okay. I think our culture at this point is obviously very in love with heroes. Think of if you were a kid born today, how many Marvel movies would you have to watch just to catch up with whatever's coming out in theaters right now? You got 50 movies to watch, bro. Get sitting or whatever if you want to make sense out of any of it and buy a ticket, right? We love that shit. It's exhausting at this point for me.
Yeah.
There was one summer a couple of years back or whatever where I went to some of the superhero movies and I was like, I hate these. These are so boring. It's the same story over and over and over again with slight variation, to the point where Hollywood will turn down scripts that they get handed if it doesn't match the Joseph Campbell hero's journey monomyth sort of thing. If they hand somebody a script, they'll turn to page 20, and if this guy's not crossing a threshold to leave his people or whatever, you wrote it wrong, fuck this, you don't know how to write movies and this won't sell, and they don't even have to read your whole script to know that this is trash. If it's not the hero's journey, people will not sit through it or whatever. That's where we're at a collective consciousness level, right? And I wrote the book kind of tongue-in-cheek as I'm riffing on the hero's journey a whole bunch early on in it, it like philosophically that like, yeah, this is a children's story, and if we want to grow the fuck up, then we need to step out of this circle of, you know, call, separation, initiation, return, call, separation, initiation, return. It's real big in the psychedelic assisted therapy and integration and, you know, all of those sorts of things. Everybody calls it a hero's journey, and we're going on. Joseph Campbell was friends with Stan Groff, and there was a way in which all of that kind of developed organically back in the 60s and 70s, whenever they were doing a lot of the height of their work. They were kind of leaning on each other for a bunch of that, right? And Joseph Campbell's a genius on a level that I don't even approach, so I don't want to pretend to know,
It's incredible, yeah, but no, it's true. Like, we get stuck in these tropes, or we get stuck in this kind of single way of, and yeah, it's not it.
Yeah, the idea being what I see whenever I look at pop culture, whenever I look at society and politics and all of the important things that we talk about in public spaces, there's the same sort of pattern being played out over and over again that resembles something like, in psychology we call it Cartman's drama triangle, where like people are playing one of these three roles. You're either a victim, you're a hero, or you're a villain. And depending on the day, you might be on any one of those 3 points there. They call it a victim, a caretaker, and a persecutor, usually in the literature, but I think people connect more meaningfully with something kind of pop culture like that, right? And every one of the stories that we're telling is about Batman against the Joker, and now it's the Penguin, and now it's Bane, and now it's whoever, right? But it's all the same kind of thing over and over and over again, so that we're wandering through life playing one of those roles all the time. We're either looking for somebody to put our pain on, like a villain, consciously or subconsciously. We're either feeling like a victim of circumstances, or my boss, or my spouse, or whoever I'm in conflict with. It's just conflict all the time. Or maybe you're trying to be a hero, and that's the good guy, right? But actually, like, if you're wandering through life only looking to like rescue somebody rather than teach them how to take care of themselves, you're contributing to the ongoing conflict even by playing the hero over and over again. I think that the next step, not to like overstate it, in consciousness evolution is recognizing that all three of those roles exist inside of you, and that's why you keep sliding into all of these different places in other people's stories, either as a villain, a victim, or a hero over and over again. It's whenever you start to watch pop culture hero movies and recognize you got an inner villain, you got an inner Joker and an inner Batman, and you got to figure out how to make some peace in your own story, in your own soul, before you're going to be able to go through life making peace for other people and resolving those conflicts. Doesn't happen by just stepping onto that drama triangle as the hero over and over and over again. So it's a lot of inner work that's necessary that I call the anti-hero's journey, to be kind of controversial with it, or kind of a little bit in your face, like the hero's journey is for kids. When you're ready to grow up, come join me on the anti-hero's journey. Works. Like, people, oh, well, what's that guy talking about? It pokes at something inside of people, and then they read the book or they listen to me and my bullshit about like consciousness evolution, and it winds up being more whole, like we were talking about before you hit record here. How do you become whole? You got to integrate shadow aspects of yourself. You got to make room for the villain inside of you. And what does that actually mean in a way that doesn't create drama for yourself and everybody else? Recognizing that the entire range of what you've seen in human history is available to you. You could be, a dictator given different circumstances, or you could be a saint given different circumstances. That whole range is available to all of us. How do you make sense of that in a way that's whole and that promotes life rather than takes advantage and tries to subjugate everybody else? Now that you've figured out and got 1% ahead of everybody else, how do you cut them off and prevent them from catching up?
How do we do that?
I think a ton of it can be accelerated through psychedelic assisted therapy. I think that's an important key component for a bunch of that. But I don't think that's the only way. I think it's stuff that exists inside of us that we've been programmed, more or less, not to recognize, and that we slide into these roles. And it's only through some way of allowing people to step outside of themselves to evaluate themselves more thoroughly. Mindfulness practices can get you there. Awe-inducing experiences can get you there. Standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon can make you kind of recognize how small you are and start to reflect on, like, the little stories that have been tying me up in knots. I can get those untied a whole bunch of different ways. That's kind of making space for all of those things to come in. There's a bunch of means that you can use to get there, but at the end of the day, all of it exists, like I said, inside of you. And it's just getting access to it. It's stepping outside of the victim story or outside of the hero story or whatever, and recognizing that it's a human being story. It's just this is what it is to be a person. Like, I'm hopeful that we can move from the hero's journey into something like what I'm calling the anti-hero's journey, and then fast forward past that as quickly as possible and just get to the journey.
Yeah.
But that's what I think life is intended to be in the first place. And that if we raise kids maybe a little bit different, a ton of the problem from my perspective is we tie people in knots whenever they're really young by trying to tell them, like, hey, this is the way the world works. I've been here, in the grand scheme of things, I've been here, a blink longer than you, but let me tell you about all that I've learned in these, 30 years out of however many billion supposedly we've been around here or whatever. Let me tell you how all of this stuff works, kiddo. And then, like, they get tied up in knots, and then a bunch of, the portion of adulthood after that, you get a whole brain around 25, 26, 27 years old. But everything that happened before that is you getting tied up into a bunch of knots. Then you get a whole brain and you start thinking, like, hey, they told me a whole bunch of stories that were bullshit. And you start untying some of those knots, you pull on some of those threads, and the stuff starts coming apart. Like, in religious circles or philosophical circles, it would get called, like, construction, deconstruction, reconstruction. It's people who leave the church and come back to a different version of it, or move from west to east, or whatever that might be. It's a bunch of just untying some of those knots somebody else tied in you in the first place, and then you deciding whether or not you even want to have any knots tied in you, and then you tie the ones that you want, recognizing consciously that that's what's happening. But maybe it'd be better if we just didn't tie knots in the first place. Right. I don't know what that would even look like. There's probably smarter people already working on it that I just haven't had a conversation with. But
this book, man, everything that you're saying, so much this book speaks to and expands on it. The radical wholeness there at the end of it, he talks about, I swear to God, everywhere I go, it's come up in conversation. I feel like it's really important to share. Because in the end particularly, it goes through practical means of applying to different aspects of our lives where this perspective that you're speaking to, where there's not, it's like even the idea of the hero's journey, the villain's journey, where it's just separatism. It's just separating an out, more occulted individual. Mm-hmm. But the real paradox and the real irony that I hear in what you're sharing is that in order to become a wholer self, we have to somehow actually step out of ourselves to witness that story and then choose what parts maybe don't fit or the story that we don't want to continue telling. I think that something that's not spoken to a whole lot in this process is the disorientation that comes with completely dismantling or untying those knots. And in psychedelic therapy in particular, we hear so much discussion about, the benefits, but working in this, obviously I've seen tons of benefit, but a lot of times along that path, there is this period of chaos and confusion where the identity is deconstructed. And I'm curious if you can speak to navigating that kind of terrifying space where we don't know who we are anymore. So, yeah.
You're asking about kind of
when those knots come
The
undone,
risks of
Yeah.
deconstruction.
yeah,
The risks
with
of,
psychedelics,
yeah.
you see it with meditation, even,
Yeah.
you know.
Maybe even to put a finer point on it is in the the literature of psychedelic research, they make distinctions between ordinary states of consciousness or our consensus reality state and then non-ordinary states of consciousness, and psychedelics being kind of a reliable way of getting a non-ordinary state. But that's kind of what we're talking about, is it's non-ordinary to take yourself out of
Yes.
your story and then hover above it in some way to evaluate it more thoroughly. Like we're just kind of down in first person shooter mode all of the time or whatever in the video game of life. Yeah, the risks there are real, I think. And I know that you've done a lot of work in the space with the classical psychedelics, and most of all of my work is with ketamine, which is a kind of a lower, shorter acting process that's a little bit more manageable. But that stepping into a non-ordinary state, opening up your consensus reality, and then having it put back together again. Yeah, absolutely. There's risks associated with that, right? Like I could describe a bit of the difficulty I'm having in trying to put together a good answer for you is that I'm maybe not as risk aversive as a lot of people are out there. Like I was drawn to being in the military, doing combat medicine, trauma medicine, climbing mountains, all of that sort of stuff. So I underestimate risk somewhat naturally, and I don't want to like undersell, like just send it, like figure out what happens on the other side of taking whatever you take is the way that I lead. But I want to recognize that what are you supposed to do if you don't have the resources inside of yourself after a journey like that? You just feel kind of wrung out by whatever that experience might be. I do think that the biggest deal with a ton of that is the role of community. Like we can talk about, it's done very poorly in the West at this point, where you need a container around someone who's going to be doing these sorts of things. Like if you're, I've been using the tying a knot, untying the knot sort of thing. If you're climbing a mountain and you're going to untie a knot, you better be real sure about which one you're untying, when, and why. And you need to have other things, other safeties in place around, hey, I'm going to untie this knot. You're not just going to untether yourself entirely without a whole bunch of risks associated with that, right? Like you fall, you die kind of risks. What we want to have in place for somebody is a whole bunch of other tethers. Like I think that's been the role of religious communities throughout time, that we're handling some of these sorts of things maybe better than some of the more modern church approaches to this. But there was an initiation process in a lot of that stuff. The first time that you were being baptized or taking a sacrament or some of those sorts of things were intended to be metaphors and experiences that were undoing a whole bunch of what came before. You repenting of this whole lifestyle that you had before and walking into a new life is supposed to be something that's pretty scary, something that's pretty intense. You're going to be a Maasai warrior, you're about to get circumcised with a real sharp rock or whatever. Like that's an intense experience to go through, right? Like there's all these rites of passage and initiation, but what kept people glued together was that the whole tribe was coming around them during that time period. And I think that's kind of, it has a light side and a dark side to it too, right? Like that's a way of staying tethered into an identity and meaning and purpose, is that the community is carrying that forward around you, so that if you're getting way, way, way out of sync with it, we can kind of all pull you back in if you've wandered off the path. There's also the danger of that community becoming an echo chamber of negativity. So there's all of the different levels at which we can analyze some of that sort of stuff. But I do think that that's the biggest deal in maintaining a level of safety for someone and preventing them from decompensating entirely, is having a community that has core commitments that you share, that you're making your way out from and coming back to along the lines of the hero's journey, right?
Well, I mean, I was just about to say that, like, one of the things that speaks to as well, there we go, is that, like, in community, in like a healthy community, I think wouldn't it be ideal that everyone's the hero, or it's all a bunch of anti-heroes? But like when I hear hero, then I see Hercules or whoever in the midst of all the people looking at that person, right?
Yeah.
But in this model that you're talking about, we can rotate and switch roles. Sometimes I am in that role, and sometimes you're in that role, and we're supporting each other. The blowing up of the ego, like what we're seeing right now in this cult of the individual, and the Instagram models or all the influencers and all this stuff, and that road ends in misery for most people, it seems like. All right, so like those people that we put up as heroes, they become tortured by that status. So how do we, like, it's like always the same kind of like cliche way to look at it, you be the change or this, that, and the other. But like, God, are there more ways to talk about bringing this perspective into reality than just leading by example? Like, because the culture, like what you're speaking to, culture is driving the ship, right? Even when there's nobody at the wheel, but we have set the course through our culture. And so, I guess, like, it's just, I'm curious if what are ways that we can shift the culture drastically enough that it starts to change that collective narrative. And maybe psychedelics are a huge component in that, seems like. I don't know, what are your thoughts on this, like shifting the narrative culturally big time?
Yeah, I think of, and I play around with this a little bit in the book. The concept is like finding truth among all of the lies that are out there. How do we figure out what's true? Because if you're in tune with truth, that helps you to be navigating the world in a way that is in flow with the nature of life. And it's whenever you're believing things that aren't true or are out of sync with reality that you run into a whole lot more problems. Now, the issues become whenever everybody's believing a lie, right? The groupthink or the collective element of deception, right? Richard Feynman's a famous science popularist and a physics professor who's famous for saying, the first rule is not to fool yourself, and you have to recognize that you're the easiest one to fool. So the idea of self-deception is simultaneously super interesting and paradoxical. Like, how do you, that's where I start with it in the book a little bit, is how to unravel the idea of self-deception. If I'm the one deceiving me about something, there's some level at which I know what's true in here and I'm hiding it from me for some reason. Like my kid would never steal money out of my purse to go do something or whatever with it, so I must have lost that, even though your kid's capable of anything any other kid's capable of doing. You love them and they're a good kid, but they do bad things from time to time or whatever, right? But in order to maintain that belief, in my kid's goodness, I'll suppress all of the evidence that, like, sure, here they are on camera taking it out of your purse or whatever. Like, nah, I don't believe that. You can be confronted with a great deal of evidence. If you have a deeper belief in something, you're going to fall back on whatever that deeper belief is, right? Just as an example of self-deception. How do you deceive yourself? If I'm the one lying to me about the nature of reality, how do I get myself out of this deep, dark hole? Do I just grab onto my bootstraps and lift myself out of here? It doesn't work that way, right? You have to have other voices that are speaking into that to some extent. Some of that community aspect is an important thing at that point to, like, just remind you. Like, that's, how do you get somebody out of, just a very deep, dark, psychotic way of relating to reality where what they believe is so out of sync with the truth? But like everything that you're saying is just going to be more evidence for that deeper held belief. It's like the QAnon thing. There's a whole bunch of ways that people get pulled down into believing things that are way out of sync with everyone around them, or as much as we understand reality, the way that it works, right? The way that I've suggested that you may be able to begin to see how to get yourself out of that, even in the absence of other voices, is the concept of irony. There are things that are ironic about the fact that I'm deceiving myself in the first place that will show up in your life in other ways. And if you can figure out where the ironic things that you believe are, that's kind of like a little thread that you can start to pull on a little bit of like, oh, it's pretty ironic that I'm living this particular way. Does that make sense?
It does, absolutely. I wonder though if we can like tease it out a little bit more for the audience. It's the same concept as paradox being the great teacher, right?
Yeah, the opposite of one profound truth isn't a lie, it's another deeply profound truth. And that's the way to hold things in tension, to walk with what are the limitations of being three-dimensional and temporal or whatever. There's going to be these paradoxes of light's a wave and it's a photon at the same time, or whatever. When we butt up against the limitations of what we got there, the tendency is to fall off the horse on one side or the other and just overemphasize one thing or overemphasize. I know that this is true. I know it. I got to lean on this. The opposite of it is also true, and that tension in between, when you get comfortable with it, is where all of the truths are and where there's a ton of fun to be had. Navigating through life in a way that trusts in those deeply held truths that are anchor points on both sides.
So interesting to me that even in the world of therapy and psychology, we tend to like polarize black and white, the diagnoses, this is segmenting things off rather than this kind of whole perspective that is the self. There's no getting away from like the self is a whole. It's not just one symptom. And I wonder, like, what you're kind of speaking to in terms of erring too far on one side or the other. Like we always lean. Are we doing that with psychedelics? As someone who has been a huge psychedelic user, aficionado, seeing the transformative power of community that was not like, I saw a lot of transformation with psilocybin in Jamaica over those 7 years, but I've seen exponentially more through Sanctuary in just a couple of years. And the only difference, well, the key difference, less mushrooms, more community. And so it has me thinking, we're all of a sudden like, oh, here's the answer. And so we Western materialists continue to go back to the medicine that's going to save us instead of the medicine that is us. And it feels like we're maybe doing that with psychedelics in a way too. But so as a clinician, how do you feel about that?
Yeah. I think that's an awesome question. So there's a way of looking at the psychedelic molecule as if it's another hero that's going to come save me as the victim, right? Like, oh, here it is, or, that's the guy in the white coat is the hero over and over again, right? Bring in the specialist. Here comes the doctor. He's going to tell me what I need to do, and I'll just do that. Okay. We're always looking for somebody else to be mom and dad over and over again, some hero to come in here. So, okay, the mushroom's the hero. It's been here a long time, or, whatever the case may be. And it has a role to play, but that's the tension over and over again, is to recognize that there is more complexity to it than just finding a hero that saved me and now everything's going to be okay. Like I need somebody else to die for my sins or whatever the case might be. It's taking a great deal more responsibility is some of the steps that we have to take in that regard for our own lives. It's taking that back, as scary as that can be, right? Like, what are you going to do? Go get a medical education to deal with the potential for developing chronic diseases? No, but you can get as educated as possible about it for yourself. Like in the military, we call it 10-level user maintenance. That's like the lowest level of understanding how a truck works so that you can keep the truck running, even though you're not a mechanic, right? Like you got this body and this operating system up here, but like, we don't spend a whole lot of time learning how to think. We don't teach kids how to think. We teach them what to think in order to like be a meaningful member of society or whatever. I think taking a step back and learning how, doing like more philosophy rather than like, checkbook balancing or whatever it is, like home economics or whatever, to figure out, like, we need to figure out some of our internal mess as far as that goes, right? Coming back to the question, though, about the balance between community and the psychedelic molecules themselves, and that idea of self-deception. Deception makes more sense, right? Like, you knowing something's true, and keeping it from me, that's an easy one, right? Like, self-deception, that's a little bit gamier or whatever. But there's clues to how to figure out how to get out of self-deception from understanding, like, Eric's lying to me. What does that mean? How do I figure out the truth from that, right? Some of it is just you expressing to someone else the ways that you're thinking that feel divergent, that feel separated. You talked about separateness. Like, I believe this thing and I believe this other thing, and invite somebody else in to say what their perspective is on you so that they can tell you. That's the role of community. And a bunch of that is like, okay, I know that I'm believing some things that are self-contradictory here, but I don't know the way out. What do you see? That's supposed to be the role of spiritual directors or spiritual communities around us, or any of that sort of stuff, or just coaches. A coach, if it's, like looking at sports or at life or business or some of those sorts of things, is where am I believing ironic things that I don't even see? Like, there's that aspect to it too, like what's in the shadow. It's asking my wife, hey, where am I screwing up? Like, just carte blanche, tell me all the things you see me doing wrong, and then having the humility to accept, like, okay, I thoroughly disagree with everything that you just said, but you might also be right, and I got to figure that out, right? It's not being in the echo chamber of your own mind that can break you out of some of those sorts of things. So it's getting new, and it's getting new voices, new experiences. It's, okay, I believe this, list of things that all match up with whatever religion or political position. I strongly believe that there are people as smart or smarter than me that disagree with me entirely about that. Go find the smartest, strongest version of the things that other people say that I disagree with, and then take that in and really absorb some of those sorts of things is the way to bring some of that stuff together.
It's very counter to our culture.
Right? The album gotta stay right. I feel so right.
To train our computers to reinforce.
Keep retargeting me with that stuff that I already learned over and over again that I don't want to hear. Same ad over and over and over again from that same ad.
Some ironies. This, like, one of the most complex creatures on this planet is so easily just hypnotized by its own repeat story. Wash, rinse, repeat.
That's all, like, all the marketing, right? Like, it's the 9th time that they see this that they'll click on it or whatever. It's like, God damn it, I gotta ignore this stuff. Shit. This thing, it just runs on its own if I'm not being careful with it, Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, as a clinician working in the psychedelic space, well, particularly with ketamine, like, I'm really interested in how you kind of help your clients work through this process after and between treatments. I mean, you mentioned that you do a little bit longer of a treatment program than most. Can you talk about your protocol and how you manage ketamine?
Yeah. Can I give you, like, my mini spiel on ketamine real quick too?
Absolutely.
Like,
yeah, please do.
People may not all be familiar with it or whatever. I know that your audience is probably very psychedelically educated, maybe more so than me. But anyway, ketamine is an FDA-approved anesthetic. At high doses, you go to sleep. I take your appendix, and you don't know I was there until later. Is the idea, right? It's
Just the idea.
It's kind of creepy, but that's what we do. It's called medicine. If you hadn't been clued into that yet, it's a weird profession for sure. But it's on the World Health Organization's essential medicines list because it's such a safe anesthetic. It's the most commonly used anesthetic in pediatric emergencies, in colonoscopy suites. Little old ladies are safe on it. Little kids are safe on it. At the extremes of life, It has very little impact on cardiorespiratory function. That's why a lot of the stuff that, you know, we developed before that, you had like this real quick window of like, all right, lights are going out in the brain, and this thing's going to stop working real quick if we don't, you know, get moving, right? That's some of the evolution of anesthesiology. Real low doses of ketamine are pain relieving. That was where I got training on it initially, was as a combat medic. We loved it because we could use it in a pre-hospital setting. If you broke a bone and you were, you know, in a lot of pain, I could start an IV, give you just a little bit of ketamine and take away some of that pain. And then if you were a whiner and you didn't shut up, I could turn it all the way up, put you to sleep, and I wouldn't have to listen to your bullshit anymore.
So is it psychoactive, or like, I've done ketamine once. I worked, with lozenges one time.
Sure.
Not obviously cigarette.
There's this window that we use in psychiatry called sub-anesthetic doses that doesn't put somebody all the way to sleep like in a surgical setting with high doses, and creates like a non-ordinary state of consciousness where it's like a dream state more than anything. Ketamine gets called like dream experiences, and it's got a short half-life in the body, so it's gone pretty quickly, where like if you're, you know, taking LSD or psilocybin, you're setting aside a day on your calendar for that to happen. A ketamine experience can be as short as 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how you do the dosing on that. So you kind of have this dream state. The way that the medicine works in the brain, we're still kind of discovering. Like, it was first synthesized in 1962. We didn't discover the receptor in the brain that it works on, called the NMDA receptor, until 1988. So that tells you a bit about the way that drug development works. They also discovered it in a fungus.
Yeah.
It's been around for millions of years, apparently, but we thought we discovered it.
That's so interesting how we synthesized the molecule or created it, but then found it in nature.
Yeah,
Very
which,
interesting.
you know, like all the lines are arbitrary lines, all the numbers are imaginary numbers, but like the difference between synthetic and organic, like we're just kind of picking up.
For sure. I mean, but it like, sorry to get off track just a little bit, but I can't help it. Like, it just causes me to question this back to the perspective of until like the observer effect, right? It's like, isn't it interesting that until we observed ketamine in a lab, we didn't see it in nature?
Sure. Yeah.
It's just interesting.
Yeah, opening up that consensus reality state in new ways, for sure. So, ketamine at those sub-anesthetic doses has also been shown to have a bunch of benefits in the brain that are related to the deficits that we see in brains that have been under chronic stress.
Really?
Things like depression, anxiety, trauma.
Like neurological
substance
benefits?
uses. Yeah, so
Okay.
you can regrow neurons in very important places in the brain very rapidly with sub-anesthetic doses of ketamine, where high doses don't seem to do that because we're turning things all the way off.
Interesting.
I could get into like the neuroscience and nerd out on that if you wanted to.
Yeah,
but
you're totally educating me and the audience here. So.
the way I like to explain it, so there's kind of three big mechanisms that seem to work in psychiatry. So like if you think about a brain that's under a lot of stress, it's going to be in fight or flight mode all of the time, and the brain optimizes itself for survival. Then it's cutting out a whole bunch of things that it doesn't need. It needs fear circuitry for, like, is that a snake? Is that a monster? Is that, you know, like, is that a saber-toothed tiger or whatever? That's what we're.
Snakes are actually not.
They're not, you know,
Anyway.
right? Yeah, got an affinity there. But trying to stay alive cuts out a lot of the joy, a lot of the connection to love, social, a lot of that
Ironic,
stuff,
isn't it?
right? It's like, how do I keep this thing alive? How do I get food in this hole and get a safe place to rest for a little while or whatever? Is what like modern life has kind of developed as like a way of functioning for whatever reason. So under chronic stress, you lose neuronal density in important places like the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. Ketamine works on that NMDA receptor, and receptors get a lot of press in neuroscience education, but the receptors are like, it's kind of the basic entry-level stuff. Like, where those are located in the brain is even more important than that. So it works on the NMDA receptor, which is something we haven't targeted in psychiatry. You always hear about serotonin, norepinephrine, and dopamine are a big deal for all of the classic antidepressants and antipsychotics out there.
Does this receptor play any role or relationship with MDA? When you say NMDA? Are they
No, so it stands for N-methyl-D-aspartate, and MDMA is methylene dioxymethamphetamine, so it's totally different. The acronyms kind of sound the same.
Well, no, MDA, which is the precursor to MDMA or MDMA. So
Right,
it goes to
the
MDA.
non-methylated amphetamine salt, yeah.
Okay.
No, none of that stuff is the same.
Okay.
The NMDA receptor is in the glutamate pathway, which is again an unusual target for psychiatric medicines. So that's why it's unique in its mechanism of action compared to a lot of other psychiatric meds out there. And at that dose, it corrects what we call the GABA to glutamate ratio. Glutamate's like a gas pedal in your brain, and GABA is like a brake pedal. And people who are under chronic stress tend to be all gas, no brake, trying, until they hit a point where they become all brake, no gas, which is where like anxious depression shifts and some of those.
Interesting metaphor, yeah.
What it does is very rapidly corrects the ratio between those two and hits kind of a reset so that like when it's time for the gas, you can hit the gas. When it's time for the brake, you can hit the brake, but you're just kind of cruising between the two instead of being all one or all the other or stomping on both at the same time. That's one aspect of how it works. It's also intensely anti-inflammatory to the degree that chronic stress produces chronic inflammation in somebody. Ketamine crushes out systemic inflammation, and there are phenotypes of depression and anxiety that have a neuroinflammatory component to them that nothing works quite as rapidly or as thoroughly as ketamine at addressing neuroinflammation as well. And then in acutely suicidal brains, there's another ratio of what we call quinolinic acid to kinanuric acid. The quin to quina ratio in somebody like if you're filling out a suicidal intent scale and you're 10 out of 10, I don't want to be here anymore, quinolinic acid follows that. And having biomarkers in psychiatry is really uncommon. There's a lot going on, so it's hard to like pull out like, serotonin imbalance is like kind of a gross oversimplification of all of those things. Quinolinic acid has stuck out as something that correlates with they did these studies in some centers where if somebody's 10 out of 10 don't want to be here anymore, they do a spinal tap and see how much CSF somebody has of quinolinic acid. That's also through the roof. Ketamine manages to correct the quin to quina ratio, and quin is neurotoxic and quina is neuroprotective, so it's moving somebody. So in the literature, ketamine gets called a rapid-acting antidepressant with a rapid-acting anti-suicidal property to it. And that's what we think is behind some of that, is correcting that ratio of this thing that's very neurotoxic. Those are the big three in terms of like the science of the mechanism of action and the background of how ketamine is purported to work. There's probably a lot more going on than we're able to understand. The other thing that I like to explain to people is, like I was saying to you before, the receptor density matters. And there's this particular part of the brain called the lateral habenula, which doesn't get a lot of attention, but I'm a nerd and I've read hundreds of papers on how ketamine works at this point, and this seems to me to be the most interesting component, is this anti-reward center in the brain. It plays a big role in the amount of stress you're under. The lateral habenula activity goes through the roof, and people want less social connection. They respond more aggressively to threats. Like there's a whole bunch of these anti-reward people who are under like defeat, who like their career's not going the way that they want to and develop depression. It has something to do with the amount of activity in the lateral habenula, which is this tiny little thing in the back of your brain that nobody would pay attention to otherwise, that I like to use the metaphor of the 300 movie for, like the 300 Spartans. Mm-hmm. They had the Battle of Thermopylae was at the Hot Gates, right? It was this narrow enough spot where the Persian Empire is descending, and it just takes 300 Spartans to hold the whole thing up, right? Depression is essentially like the 10,000 nations of the Persian army are descending upon you, and our arrows will blot out the sun. And ketamine says, well, then we'll fight in the shade, and they pick the lateral habenula as a place to have that take place because there's a lot of NMDA receptors in the lateral habenula. So we get this correction in this very important, very narrow relay where there's a lot of things happening in the cortex and in the front brain connecting to things happening back here and in the lower brain, that whenever we correct it in that one little place, it buys somebody a whole lot more time to do the work in therapy to try to help return to full function or even optimized mental health function. What you had asked about was like how I do this a little bit differently in my clinic. The standard across the industry varies. They estimate there's somewhere between 500 and 750 ketamine clinics in the world today, where that's kind of the focus of how.
Seems like a small number, actually.
Right. Yeah, it's gotten a lot bigger recently, but that's the estimate as of, I think it was 2019, so it may have blown up a whole lot more since then. But in any event, the clinical trials, people get 6 ketamine sessions in short succession in like a 2 or 3 week time frame to see whether or not that separates from an active comparator like a benzodiazepine like midazolam, so that somebody feels altered but doesn't necessarily have like the psychedelic component isn't the focus of that. These are like biological psychiatry trials, the same as like does this SSRI separate from a sugar pill in terms of reducing depression across these 6 weeks. That's the point, is to figure out if we can get a separation. Okay, this works better than placebo. Now we can build some more trials to test that more thoroughly, et cetera, et cetera. The way that those trials got run then this is what we have evidence for, so that got translated into the clinic as, okay, we'll just copy paste the way that the trials got run. So if you go to the average ketamine clinic, you're going to see somebody get an IV infusion like Monday, Wednesday, Friday for 2 weeks straight, and that's the treatment induction, and it's just focused on getting you this medicine. Like, it's still just the right medicine at the right dose for the right diagnosis should help you, and it does help some people. But I think that not understanding the background of like, that's how you run a clinical trial, because you only have that time and that space and enough money to do this, is trying to do this as fast as possible for as little money as possible and see what the outcome is how we do science. That's not how we do healing,
Practice,
right? So the way that I approach it is it's combined with therapy. Most of the places, maybe you'll have like a coach or somebody that'll sit with you if you want them to, or you're on your own. You can go to places where it's like there's just curtains hung between like 6 beds, and the guy down here is in like the 9th dimension screaming, and the guy over here's having a blissful experience, and you're confused about what the hell's going on or whatever. Like it runs the gamut. I've heard all kinds of crazy stories about other places. Anyway, so the way I do it is you're going to work with me on doing this. I don't have like a coach that sits with you or something like that. I do have some therapists that I'll collaborate with in town that I know and that I trust. But we're going to do it across 6 weeks, and we're going to do it ketamine session and an integration session alternating. So you're going to see me twice a week for 6 weeks. And the reason that I do that is it's so disruptive to somebody's life to try to take basically 2 weeks off from work or whatever to get in 6 sessions of treatment, that for people who are feeling better, they still are barely breaking even on the amount they got to catch up on from being out for 2 weeks from school or from work or whatever that might be. I saw that often enough doing it other places where it was like, well, this is the juice isn't worth the squeeze on doing this. They wind up feeling better, but then right back into what's a twice as stressful situation as before. Right. All of the literature from performance psychology, like I do some work with athletes and executives and some of that sort of stuff, where habit loop changes have to happen for 30 to 45 days or so in order for you to change the way that you think, feel, and relate. You need to stop doing one thing and replace it with something else consistently for around 30 to 45 days. That doesn't happen in a 2-week ketamine window. So I stretch it out to 6 weeks so that we're doing work in the therapy, not just around talking about like the ketamine dream that you had, which can be deeply meaningful for a lot of people. It's also looking at your life, like, hey, let's clean up your sleep, let's clean up your nutrition, let's get you exercising, let's get you out into nature. What are ways to develop new connections? What are the habits you've developed as the depressed version of yourself, the traumatized version of yourself? And what are strategic evidence-based ways of figuring out what we can replace that particular behavior with that's going to stick? And then let's do it, and I'm going to tune you up over and over again. Twice a week we're going to do this. You get the neuroplastic window with ketamine lasts for 24 to 72 hours afterward. So there's this opportunity of growing new neurons biologically in important places, and then having important conversations about how do we change the way that you've been to a healthier version of you and make that stick, and do it across a window of time that's going to happen, that we have all the evidence for. Not charging any extra, it's the same cost as any place else. It's just more effective. And I was telling you before, I just got done writing a book to try to support people through that process. It's not like intended to be like a bestseller to send out there or whatever. It's just something to give to people that is an integration journal. It's a walk through Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces, chapter by chapter, with just like 3 or 4 pages of meaningful reflections on that, and 5 questions for you to do at the end of every day or the beginning of every day, so that you're seeing me on a Monday for a ketamine-assisted therapy session for 90 minutes. You're seeing me on a Tuesday for 60 minutes to do a therapy session. And then those other 5 days, you've also got a journal that I wrote that we can talk about together, and you can tell me why this chapter sucked or why this is really great or whatever. And you're doing the work absolutely every single day to try to get yourself out of wherever you've been and back up to a whole version of yourself, to come back around to radical wholeness.
I love it. Wow. Yeah. So sounds so much more thorough than most other ketamine plans that I've ever been exposed to, which has been my kind of biggest hang up with ketamine therapy is just like, again, it's just like industrializing psychedelics, pump them with the meds, send them home, see what happens.
Yeah, I think we can do a lot better.
Yeah, for sure. So what about community? How's community fit into the model that you're working with?
That's a tough one, and that's something that I'd love to hear anybody's ideas about how to do that better, because like I'm in a clinical context. It's not like I'm like, okay, so let's also start doing group therapy with everybody that's doing ketamine-assisted therapy with me. Maybe that works, maybe that doesn't. I don't know how to set all of that sort of stuff up. Like, hey, how do we build community around that? That's the thing that's a lot of the people that I work with struggle the most with too, is like you start to isolate yourself or to feel isolated. We all feel that, I think, in America at this point, on a whole, like, deeply disturbing existential level of just being isolated, being lonely, and then you throw on all of these struggles on top of that. And that's something what, like, people are asking me all the time, is like, so who should I be talking to? Like, who are safe people? Who are good people? Who can I connect with? What communities can I plug into? They're like, like all the people at church are judging me for doing this, psychedelic thing or whatever. Even though you've got a Master of Divinity degree or whatever, maybe that makes it okay in some circles or whatever. That's not going to be available everywhere. Is it like, can you plug into an online community? Can you? And I just try to do an index of somebody's life. Like, what does make sense? Like, you're a young mom with kids. Is there a way for you to plug in to sports? Or like, is the school community an opportunity for that? Is there a church where people aren't dicks about all of this sort of stuff? Or like, or just affinity groups is really all like that's out there or whatever, right? Like, do you like weightlifting? Go join a CrossFit gym. It's basically like a church for weightlifters. Do you like rock climbing? Do you like, there's backpacking groups, there's group exercise stuff, like any of the positive things that you're naturally drawn to. That's the upside of the internet, is there's an affinity group for everything everywhere at this point. So like, whatever it is, the underwater left-handed basket weaving thing is your thing, there's a Facebook group for that, and it probably meets just down the street from you and you didn't even realize it. Go searching online for some of that stuff. And Louisville's great for stuff like that. Like, I can't even believe patients come back and tell me all about, like, hey, have you heard of this mushroom church or whatever that's local here? I'm like, yeah, I've heard a few things or whatever, yeah. Like, I think what you're doing makes sense to me more than a lot of what other people are doing around trying to create a community that is, like you described, like more holarchic rather than hierarchical, and is you're not trying to be a guru. I'm not trying to be a hero. We're just trying to get people connected to other people and enjoying their lives together over and over again. Yeah.
100%. What about, I've always been I wanted to have this conversation with someone who knows ketamine about the habit-forming potential of ketamine.
Yeah, sure.
How real is that?
Has the risk for being a drug of abuse, and there's plenty of examples of people going off the rails.
Yeah, are you snorting ketamine every night, or what's your?
I would like to be a psychonaut someday when I grow up, but like, I got too much on my plate to have any of that sort of problem. Like, I got a wife and 4 kids and.
Yes, DMT somewhere. I'm sure.
Right, there's a molecule for everybody, right? Like, you're an investment banker and you get 15 out of 1. You just go and talk to your DMT girlfriend a little bit, and then come back into it or whatever. Like, I hear all the stories, right? Ketamine, like, it's a rapid-acting antidepressant in the medical literature. If you're reading between the lines, it means that it's fun, right? Which is why it becomes important. Like, there are people who come to work with me who eventually we have to have the conversation of, like, I think we've hit the point where this is not going to do anything more for you, and you should just continue in therapy without ketamine as a piece of that mix. Like, it's ketamine-assisted therapy, not ketamine therapy. The therapy is the prime mover in the way that this, right? Exactly. It's not like we're just distributing this or whatever, like you're the legal drug dealer and all of that sort of stuff. It's all about taking care of that person and making sure that we don't get into that place of like, now this is a crutch. This is them just leaning on this again, where they leaned on other things in the past. It's again like the molecule isn't the hero. You got to figure out how to build those resources inside of you so that you can have that level of agency to navigate the world without there's any more crutches than you actually need.
That's such a good perspective. I love to hear you say that the molecule is not the hero. Just having done that myself over the years and seeing how easy it is for that narrative to just translate over into something else, that's not the answer.
Well, that's some of why I'm excited about, like, hopefully the future of both, like, of all of the ways of gaining safe, responsible access to more molecules. The decriminalization, the legalization, the medicalization. There's all these different routes that are kind of on parallel tracks in their own ways to helping people gain access to molecules that, like ketamine has some risk potential for people to go out and try to find it in the wild and then get hooked on it and create a whole bunch of problems for themselves. And it takes more than it gives at a certain point with any of that sort of stuff. There's other molecules out there that just aren't a threat of abuse. Something like ibogaine, from what I hear, nobody's having a good time on ibogaine. Nobody's like, every weekend, I just want to like see the face of God and be torn apart 3 times and then explained all the secrets of the universe to me or whatever. I don't know what that's like, no personal experience with that one, but I hear like you're setting aside a week's worth of time for 1 day's worth of medicine. How is that a drug of abuse? Like, who's going to abuse how painful that healing process appears to be, given what the reported anecdotal outcomes are on the other side for people struggling with addictions of all kinds. I think there's a lot of promise there, but the idea that like that's something somebody's going to misuse or abuse. Same thing with mega doses of some of the classical psychedelics seem to have both the most benefit behind them in terms of the stuff that's being measured in clinical trials out of like Johns Hopkins and Stanford for depression or end-of-life anxiety or like megadosing some of those things. Yeah, it's the most meaningful experience of their life. That nobody's going to take 10 grams on a weekend every weekend for a good time. Like that's just going to destroy you, I think, at a certain point. Like there's the risk-reward matrix on some of that stuff's a whole lot different than on stuff like that. That's the other thing. People are already doing the abusing of these medicines, right? Like, it's not like, like the FDA ruling around MDMA about like, we need more information about the safety of this medicine, as if something like 300,000 people haven't already been taking it in the wild on the weekend, going to a dance hall or whatever. Like, I don't know.
So we'll just pause our
it's all just stalling, right? Yeah, like it's an obvious sort of stall tactic and some of that stuff. But yeah, there's human beings have the capacity to figure out how to abuse pretty much anything that's in the created order at this point. Like we'll just find something and decide that's my thing, and I'm just gonna like let this thing destroy me instead of this other thing.
It comes again from that sense of separation though. It's this thing that's outside of me that I need to complete me, and that codependency just ends up destroying the individual.
Yeah, if I'm not whole in myself, carrying that around with me, then I'm always gonna be looking for something to plug the holes that are in.
And there's always holes.
There's always like feels like I guess you can get to enlightened states where there are no holes to fill, but
it's super boring.
It doesn't sound fun. Like, oh, there's another hole. Okay, how do you fix the hole instead of fill the hole? That's been like, I didn't expect this as I started kind of looking through personal growth, although it should have just been, foregone conclusion that this idea of personal growth is the life process. If you're a conscious, aware human being, which is an interesting kind of paradox in itself, that we are born whole. We come into this world as like whole, and then we get tied knots, and like the journey of life is to get back to who we were basically when we came in here, just a pure, vulnerable, raw, open. I don't know. It's interesting to me how.
There's definitely a developmental component to the whole thing, right? Like we're growing.
Oh yeah.
We're growing brain. We're growing bone. We're just growing as an organism to begin with, and there's some ways that are in sync with the nature of that growth, and there's some ways that are out of sync with the nature of that growth that can play a role in whether or not you develop fully into yourself or not. There's a bunch of, that's all that disease really is something that's working at cross purposes to that, right? Like you get a bone cancer, you're not going to grow bone the way that you're supposed to, and that creates a whole bunch of deficits and difficulties. You get taught a bunch of things that are essentially toxic about whatever, about religion, about gender roles, about money, about whatever, whenever you're a kid, and those are going to continue to work at cross purposes that prevent that development from taking place naturally. That's all that dis-ease winds up being over and over again, is a way of impeding or disrupting the natural developmental course of a human being. And I think we'd be better served by trying to figure out what that natural developmental course is and optimizing for that over and over and over again, rather than like a lot of the ways that we've talked about. A bunch of that stuff is very atomistic and individualistic. Maslow's hierarchy of needs even has a whole bunch of problems with it. I mean, he plagiarized all of that from Blackfoot tribes. And
oh, I did not know that.
Yeah, he spent a year with them, and then all of a sudden had this epiphany about ways of working or whatever. And he, the top of it is self-actualization, but in their traditions, it was community actualization. Like you become self-actualized for the purpose of service to the tribe, rather than like for the purpose of building your empire or whatever the case might be. Yeah.
Do you know what I look for to find the Blackfoot version?
There's some decent, there's some folks who've done some articles on some of the background stuff up there. I think if you just Googled like Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
Maslow plagiarism
or something like that, it would come up or whatever. I make a joke about it in the book in passing for sure, but I do think, like, have you ever read the Jed McKenna trilogy, the Enlightenment trilogy? Because you brought up Enlightenment. You'd enjoy it. It's a pretty wild, sort of fun read. Like Terence McKenna being kind of an Enlightenment guru back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and Dennis is still around, his brother, I think. And the two of them going down to South America looking for molecules and discovering psilocybin's kind of a wild story. But Jed McKenna is a pseudonym. This guy wrote these books about how to become enlightened in like an American way, instead of like this, you got to sit on top of a mountain and follow the guru's instructions until you attain enlightenment or whatever, and then like you can change your name from Richard Alpert to Ram Dass at that point or whatever. Jed McKenna just kind of lays it out like the fast way to get there, but it's terrifying along the way what it would take to become enlightened in that particular way. And I play around with a little bit of that in the book too, if that's of interest to people. But the idea is like Jed McKenna is a pseudonym. My name's Ben Askins, and it always has been, and it always will be. And like I'm just going to say sorts of things that he winds up saying, but kind of hiding behind a pseudonym for some reason. The guy's real name was Stephen Peterson or something like that, and then like he changed his name after people figured out that he'd written these books. They were kind of a phenomenon in the 90s and early 2000s.
Okay,
yeah, check them out. They're super interesting. But yeah. Stealing from him a little bit, like he just says that there's 3 stages to human development. There's being a child, There's being an adult, and there's being an enlightened one. And being an enlightened one adds nothing to being an adult. But that word nothing is loaded. Which is what I play around with as the zero with 1,000 faces instead of the hero with 1,000 faces. Which is some of those sorts of ideas of like what the Buddha had to say about what enlightenment was, and that, you know, Maya and everything's an illusion, and word games and all of that sort of stuff.
I'm sorry to use a read this before we sit down, but I'm very much looking forward to reading it.
Yeah. It was a lot of fun to write.
When is your journal available?
It's already available on Amazon. It's called The Hero's Journey for Anti-Heroes.
Okay.
And you can order it now, and it'll get delivered in a couple of days. But yeah, it's out there and available. It's a lot longer book. It's amended. This one, the feedback that I got on it is it's about 150 pages with pictures, but everybody says they have to read it twice to start to understand it, because I'm playing a lot of like philosophy games in kind of a punk rock sort of way. Like I'm trying to bring together like I dedicated the book to Jesus H. Christ and to Hunter S. Thompson. Trying to bring together and resurrect a little of that Hunter S. Thompson style of gonzo writing or whatever. But like I've read a lot of philosophy and a lot of science, and I'm a big nerd. Trying to boil that down in a way that lightens people up.
Yeah, I like the synthesis that you bring of these different perspectives and worlds, and even in your life experience, you know, from the farm you talked about through the military now into psychiatric clinical work. It's like you have some really unique perspectives that seem to, you know, present a very unique whole.
Yeah.
So thanks.
Don't call me a hero.
No, definitely not a hero. And I'm not your guru.
Right. Nailed it.
Doc, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thanks for
joining.
Thanks for the invitation, brother.
Absolutely. We'll do it again.
Yeah.